let's get. Okay, by now, YouTube, if you're not actually like recording this by now, we have beef. We have beef at that point. But we should have everything here. Yep, we do. And at this point, well, I think we know what's going to happen. The goat has uploaded. I have pinged myself. Because of course I have. And I'm just gonna preemptively do that because it is just insane. I'm not even gonna look at the comments. But
What if Minecraft oceans looked like this? I'm going to update all 9 ocean biomes, giving each a unique makeover with new custom world gen techniques. From the waves above to the caves far below, join me as I turn this overworld into an overrealm.
So, just a bit of context. This is part of his. Just like he had a whole series about the biome strongholds, which is complete. You can even watch my reaction to some of the later biome strongholds videos, particularly the plains biome stronghold. Like, I was legitimately like losing my mind over how good the plains biome stronghold looks, especially the market stalls. I'm still working on the SMP thing for like doing that, although I might actually end up waiting until the Overrealm is completed and publicly available. Which, if Kanokarab keeps getting all these epic collaborations for SMP stuff and like world gen things that he keeps doing, might not be for a while. But that way I can actually, get some practice in. I might do a few like trial runs with like normal world gen stuff before actually going into the Overrealm thing, like getting like learning how to do stuff and all that. But basically, like he's going to be taking all the different like biomes in the overworld and updating them, upgrading them. He did that with the forest biomes, and so now he's doing it with the ocean biomes. So
There are a total of 9 ocean biomes, so I really have my work
this is, by the way, this is the birch forest from the previous iteration of the data pack.
cut out for me. Currently, a lot of the space occupied by oceans can feel very samey. They tend to all have not necessarily the exact same quantities, but you'd be forgiven for not realizing the quantities of seagrass and kelp are different between the biomes, and so most of the visual changes that you get from ocean to ocean come from the ground block, either gravel or sand. So a major part of what I'll be doing is giving each a distinct identity. And since data packs still can't add data-driven blocks, these are the options that I'm stuck with for decorating my oceans. But I still think there's a lot of great visual distinction that we can do, some variety between each of these biomes, even just from changing the quantities, the frequencies of seagrass and kelp.
I should say, he pointed out data-driven blocks. When Mojang adds data-driven blocks to the game, this dude will become a literal god in the world. He will be unstoppable.
How tall they are, how often you get tall seagrass versus short seagrass, and of course, their general frequencies, in addition to many other features that we can add. For example, while I do want kelp and seagrass to be accessible in all of the ocean biomes in some capacity because of their relevance for feeding turtles or for being smelted into food or further fuel, there's nothing saying we can't add some custom trees that can generate here at the bottom of the ocean to represent various shapes that you would find at the bottom of oceans. We are going to need to stray a little bit from reality while still taking some inspiration from it where we can. Additionally, if you ask me, islands that can generate out in the oceans can be a little bit plain. So I want to give these islands their own unique identity as well, though we won't spend a whole lot of time and resources on it because of course they are still pretty rare and pretty small. Also, just to curb some expectations, I don't plan on changing the beaches in this particular video. Those will come in their own update video down the line as we continue to work on the overrealm. But as you can see, they definitely need that love. Most of them are pretty plain, and currently, short grass is able to generate on them because, of course, I made it so vegetation could grow on sand for the desert update. Now, a big part of...
I forgot about the desert update. So it's the forest and the desert that he's completely, like, overhauled. And now it's the ocean. I'd forgotten about that. Oh my word, I'm sorry, Kanokorab. I am so sorry, I forgot.
Why there are 9 ocean biomes is because 4 of them are just deep variants that fill in the deeper portions of the ocean terrain, where terrain dips even lower than the regular ocean seafloor level. For the vanilla biomes, the difference between a lukewarm ocean and a deep lukewarm ocean mostly comes down to the terrain, and the only reason that they are distinguished is primarily for ocean monument spawning. However, for my oceans, I do want the deep oceans to have a distinct, though related, visual identity compared to their shallow ocean counterparts. So I am definitely quadrupling the amount of work that I would technically need to do, but it's in pursuit of a more complete project in my eyes. So with that, let's clear away all of the ocean features that we don't need, and then we can start planning and ideating on what features we want to repopulate these biomes with. Technically, this is probably already much more accurate to most of the real-world oceans. But that's not going to do for here. We want these oceans to be nice to look at, fun to play in and explore, and add a new breath of life to the overworld, to the overrealm. Now, with that said, for the regular kind of default ocean biome, I do want to kind of go for a quintessential ocean floor. So I'm thinking a fair amount of dirt, but obviously we don't want to do all dirt because that's not very interesting. So I think we'll probably do a noise pattern of some small strands of sand, and then we can have large globs of gravel as well, kind of mixed in with the dirt. So in fact, if we build the dirt out kind of like this, it's probably a little bit closer representation to what I think I'm going to be going for. Something roughly like this, and we might actually play a little bit with which particular block is the blob versus the bulk versus the strands. You know, we'll mess around with that. I'll change the values and see which one ends up creating the nicest effect, but I think that'll give us a more interesting ocean floor that still looks, you know, quintessentially ocean. I also think it'd be neat if we varied the terrain a little bit. I think I might try and use the new template feature here in 26.2 to create some kind of like shelves, some kind of round-ish, not perfectly circular, we obviously want them to look natural, but some just shelves that seagrass and possibly even some like corals and things can sit on. And this will obviously have the same kind of noise pattern and decoration as the terrain down here. I think with enough of these, they'll help kind of break up the horizon as you're swimming down at the bottom of the ocean, fulfilling much of the same role that trees do in designing surface biomes. Now, like I said, I do want seagrass and kelp to be in all of the ocean biomes, but I think in the ocean biome in specific, they're not going to be super common. They'll be a little bit sparse, generally in small patches. We'll probably make the kelp features a little bit shorter, a little bit on the shorter end. But I also think, like I mentioned, it might be interesting to have some corals here as well. Probably not a whole lot, and probably mostly the regular corals and coral fans, not the coral blocks. Probably keep those pretty limited to very specific niches, but I think adding a little bit of extra color and decoration and just variety in the blocks will help kind of bring the biome together, even while not making the corals the chief focus like they will be for the warm ocean. There's not really any balance reason for corals to be relegated exclusively to the warm oceans, and warm oceans are big enough anyway that they're common enough that I don't feel bad putting corals in some other places, because the warm ocean will still have much more coral and unique coral structures that'll likely set it apart from the small appearances that corals might have here. I think the last thing that I want to add to this biome, and indeed probably all of the ocean biomes, is some kind of a fossil structure. I have a pretty specific idea for what I'm going to be looking for here, so I think actually at this point, let's go ahead and go into a flat world and put some of these builds together for the shelf templates as well as this fossil, and we can see how that is going to inform the rest of the ocean biome. We're here in the overwhelmed flat world right beside all of the forest, logs, and ruins, though there have been a few changes there that I won't get into right now, but suffice to say things are working a little bit better now that we're in 26.2. What's new, however, is these shelf structures that I put together. We've got a small, medium, and large one, and I think they look reasonably common while still feeling very unique and very special, and so should add some nice shape to the seafloor and serve as a great location for various populations and colonies of seagrass and kelp and small amounts of coral to live on, kind of like their own little mini coral reefs. I've built them out of stone and gravel so that they can be easily replaced and changed with whatever blocks are needed for any biome that we choose to place them in. Currently, they're definitely going in the ocean biome, and so they're going to get that same noise pattern that I was planning earlier, thanks to the features that I'll use to cover that. But if we want to reuse these again, we'll be able to with pretty much the same method. These are going to get placed by the new template feature in 26.2, which is going to make it really easy to place them on the seafloor while keeping them intact, so they won't melt if they end up getting placed on kind of a weird cliff or even just a small hill. What is going to melt is these fossil structures over here, which I've designed to look like a whale fall. Apparently there's a whale fall movie coming out. I don't think it looks very good, but whale falls in real life are a really important part of ocean and seafloor ecosystems. When a whale dies, naturally, as animals tend to do, it ends up sinking to the seafloor, and that is a huge amount of nutrients that can go towards the various life that lives on the seafloor.
Actually, I'm gonna look that up quickly. Whale Fall movie coming out. Is it based off of a true story? Yep. Following the death of his father, Jay Gardner goes diving off the coast of California in search of his remains. He soon finds himself in a desperate fight for survival when he's trapped solid whole by a massive whale. Trapped within its belly, he must figure out a way to escape as his oxygen supply starts to run out. Hmm. Interesting.
All kinds of crustaceans and mollusks and plankton and all kinds of things start to eat those remains and make use of those nutrients. And so we have the main fossil structure as well as 3 overlay structures to represent different stages of that decay. This bone fossil structure will get placed first, and then either this sulfur overlay, cinnabar overlay, or dead brain coral overlay will get placed on top of it. Only part of it though. I'll use a processor to replace some of these blocks with water, or rather ignore them.
It would be interesting if he had all 4 of them like mishmashed together, like a patchwork decay.
Altogether when they get overlaid onto the bones, probably in fact most of these blocks, so that you get mostly bone blocks with either a little bit of sulfur or a little bit of cinnabar or so on. Each of these color choices, and in some cases even the specific block choice, is meant to represent a particular stage of decay. For example, at certain points in a whale fall's lifespan, the decay has become so great that some of the organisms that are feeding off it start to produce sulfur or sulfur-related, minerals and compounds that other organisms in life that is feeding on the whale fall can then start to feed upon and continue the cycle, sort of. Now, there isn't a great block to represent the final stage of decay when pretty much all the nutrients and everything else from the whale fall from the bones would have been completely picked clean, but dead brain coral block gets us pretty close. It obviously looks quite dead. It's got these kind of holes in it, so it looks like it's been kind of eaten away. There's not much left, and by virtue of being coral as well, it sort of represents that by the time all those nutrients are gone and there's nothing else for the whale fall to really, give back to the bottom feeders and life forms that live at the bottom of the ocean, it still serves a purpose as the structure for coral reefs to start to form around. My plan is to have this whale fall structure get placed as part of a new sequence feature that was also added in 26.2, so that I can represent the life that is feeding on the whale fall with a sequence of extra seagrass and kelp and corals that are propagated around and specific to the whale fall, regardless of how common they are in the particular biome the whale fall has appeared in. So, like there won't be much seagrass or kelp, or even frankly a lot of coral in the regular ocean biome, largely confined to the shelves, and even then not too much, the whale falls in particular are going to have way more of all of that life, mostly because that's the main kind of life that we have to work with. We don't have crabs or octopuses or anything that I can spawn particularly on these structures, nor would I be able to build them in a way that I think would be satisfactory. But that doesn't mean that we can't meaningfully represent the importance of these real-life phenomena to these real-life ecosystems, even if not accurately. Let's get all these implemented back in the overrealm and see how the new ocean biome comes together. From the surface, this already looks transformed. A little plain, but definitely unique, definitely different from the very, samey and familiar oceans that we had before. All of these shelf structures are template features, like I mentioned, and they're also being placed by sequence features, like I was talking about with the whale falls. And I've done this so I can take advantage of the unique properties of the sequence feature to make it so that about 2/3 of them do not have any coral and instead are only populated with seagrass. I'm able to do this by listing in the sequence feature first the actual template, the shelf that is being selected, and then the seagrass feature, which just randomly spreads some seagrass along the X, Y, and Z axes around the shelf. But then for the coral feature, which we see an example of over here, I have a rarity filter placement modifier being applied so that only about 1 in every 3 times that feature gets called, it actually succeeds. Smaller shelves like this one only have 1 coral feature in the sequence list, but larger ones like this medium one, or indeed the large ones, which we don't have a clear example of, I think there's one back there, they have 2 or 3 coral features listed, but only the first one has the rarity filter. If that first one happens to fail, like in this example or this example, then the sequence stops. It doesn't try generating any of the remaining features. Which is how we're able to have most of these shelves not have any coral, even though technically they were placed by a sequence that could have placed 2 or even 3. I've kept the seagrass and the kelp pretty sparse. You'll see most of the seagrass is short with a little bit of tall seagrass. I had to use the seagrass feature for this in order to get the tall seagrass because for some reason, at least in the current version, trying to place tall seagrass using a simple block feature like we can do for regular tall grass on the surface doesn't work. It just fails to place. I'm not sure if that's going to be fixed in 26.3. I sure hope so, because they're removing the seagrass feature at that point. For the kelp, I was able to use a block column feature. I did not have to use the kelp feature, and so that gives me a lot of control over not only their height, but also whether it can grow. One thing that kind of annoys me about vanilla oceans, and this is like such a minor thing, but I don't like that as you spend more time in a world or in an area, all the kelp ends up growing all the way up to the surface and creating just this really thick forest of kelp. And because so much of the oceans are so samey and so filled with kelp, it just kind of exacerbates that problem. However, kelp has an age block state, which if you set it to 25, makes it not able to grow anymore. So I can have all of the kelp in this particular biome stay at this particular height. Of course, you can grab a kelp, you can break it and then place it yourself, and that kelp will grow. And that's obviously very important. But for the naturally growing kelp, it growing and you spending time in the world isn't going to change the natural beauty of this particular biome. We aren't going to do that for every biome. Like I said, every biome is going to have kelp, and some biomes are going to have kelp that is able to grow, but it's going to be done with intent. It's going to be used in biomes that are intended to be very filled with kelp, and this is not that. Now let's fly around and see. This looks like it might be a bit of a small ocean biome, but we'll see if we can find one of those whale falls. Ah, here's one. Okay, that wasn't too bad. I've made these whale falls less common than dungeons underground, but nowhere near as rare as desert wells in the deserts, or badlands for that matter. It looks like for this particular one, we got the sulfur variant, so you can see because we had a different overlay structure for each of those different blocks, we don't get a mixture of bone and sulfur and cinnabar and dead coral. We only get the sulfur so that it represents this entire whale fall being at that particular stage of decay. I am using a processor to replace a small amount of the sulfur with potent sulfur to kind of represent that further breaking down of nutrients and dispelling them into the open water, but you'll notice that because we aren't near the surface of the water, getting nearby these bubbles does not give you the nausea effect because we don't have those gas clouds as they escape the bubbles. Oops. This is also a situation where we can see that unique behavior of kelp at play because the kelp that is placed by the whale fall sequence is able to grow. So even in this ocean biome where all the rest of the kelp is going to stay at that height, you'll have these kind of indicators, I guess, of the existing and growing ecosystem and life that exists here at the seafloor from the kelp that continues to grow as it feeds off the nutrients from the whale fall. Of course, further exemplified by all of the coral, as well as the glow lichen, which is a particularly important factor, because I want players to be able to see, to have these locations highlighted, and I'm probably going to use them in way more capacities in other biomes as well, so that we can draw, particular specific attention to things that I want the player to be able to see from the surface, to draw them down into the ocean, not just to reward them for already swimming down here. Now, because compatibility is important to me for this Overwhelmed project, the surface of the oceans is not being handled with a surface rule, because that would require overwriting the noise settings file, which would make this very incompatible with any terrain data packs. Because I'm only modifying biomes, you can use the Overwhelmed with something like Tectonic, and they'll work together just fine. So in order to change the seafloor from gravel, I'm using a disk feature that I'm projecting to the ocean floor world gen height map to put them on the seafloor, where they can then apply a noise state provider to the blocks that are there, specifically to the gravel and to the stone. And that noise pattern is, of course, how we get these large areas of dirt that have these kind of skinnier strands, especially noisy strands of sand. And then we have still some small areas of gravel, because I felt that was still important here. But in doing so, I have gotten rid of the disks that would normally generate here in the oceans. I got rid of the sand and the gravel, and in particular, the clay disks that would normally be in oceans. There should still be plenty of clay in rivers, and we may even expand upon that when we eventually get to updating the rivers for the Overrealm. Now, I would rather have not used disks, but unfortunately vegetation patches like I've used... Now, I would rather have not used disks. Unfortunately, vegetation patches like I've used... Now, I would rather have not used disks. It would have been much nicer, easier...
Wait a minute. Wait just a minute. Hey, excuse me. Hey, yo. Kodogorov, I think there's an issue. Come on.
Now, I would rather have not used disks. It would have been much nicer, easier, and frankly more performant to use vegetation patches like I did for the desert here. But unfortunately, vegetation patches do not work underwater. That is a specific and, as far as I know, intentional limitation that they have. So we're stuck with using disks, which are still pretty performant, but at the rate that we're using them and due to their specific size limitations relative to vegetation patches, we need to use a lot more of them, which does drag down the performance a little bit more than my custom deserts. Next up, I think I'd like to work on the lukewarm oceans, the regular as well as the deep, though I have different ideas for each. I want the regular lukewarm ocean to be kind of like a huge underwater grassy plains. Absolutely tons and tons of seagrass, probably a lot of tall seagrass as well, maybe even mostly tall seagrass with some short seagrass. Obviously, we do still want kelp to be in this biome, as with all biomes, so I think probably what I'll do is make 1 or 2 block tall kelp plants that, again, cannot grow, that have that age 25 block state, so that they kind of blend in with the seafloor, with the grassy plains aesthetic, without disrupting it, while still making kelp able to be obtained here. I do like the texture that sand adds, especially the contrast that it has with probably what's going to be a very heavy amount of green between the seagrass and the kelp, but I think I'd like to accentuate that even more with a much smoother and larger noise pattern of moss blocks down here. Definitely a little bit fantastical, but hoping that it can kind of start to represent almost like a bottom-feeding algae of some kind, and add just that much more greenery, pseudo-realism, but especially strong visual identity to the lukewarm ocean. The deep lukewarm ocean will probably also have some moss, but I'm probably going to have it be handled by an altar ground decorator of a tree feature to represent a very large kelp plant. I've done something similar before for the lunar phase, but I have some new tricks that I'm able to do in 26.2 that I think will make this work even better. This will be the biome, I think, that will have a lot of kelp plants, and a lot of kelp plants that are able to grow. They'll probably be quite tall to kind of work alongside those kelp-like tree structures that we'll have, that this is not necessarily a representation of, but we'll have some trees that look like kelp alongside the regular kelp block columns that are able to grow, and then still some seagrass so that it is obtainable here, but probably not nearly as much as in the regular lukewarm ocean. The lukewarm ocean is dedicated to seagrass, and the deep lukewarm ocean will be dedicated to the kelp. I think this is also a great opportunity to make shipwrecks feel much more involved and incorporated with the biome. Right now, they feel kind of stuck onto it, tacked on a little bit. And I think as we develop the ocean biomes more, that's just going to be even more kind of stark. I don't want to change the structure specifically. I don't want to change the structure generation or anything, but I do think I can use some features in the biomes to decorate and integrate the shipwrecks with the biome a little bit more and make it feel a little bit more alive and varied and changed alongside the rest of the oceans. I'm thinking this is going to be a great opportunity to have colonies of coral start to be growing on the shipwrecks, very similar to what we saw with the whale falls, but probably much older and much more developed colonies of coral. We'll have like noise patterns of these coral blocks, probably still a lot more of like the seagrass and the kelp that we saw with the whale falls, but also coral that is matched to the block that it's being placed on. So tube coral fans only on tube coral, brain coral fans only on brain coral, and so on. I think if I left the shipwrecks alone, they would feel kind of odd. So this will be a nice way to make them feel like they're part of the team a little bit. Let's get all that put together. By the way, if you're enjoying the video, please remember to like and subscribe for more custom world gen, structures, and data pack content. If you want to learn more about getting into custom world gen yourself, check the link in the description for my very thorough written guide that I've made for Data Pack Hub, where I am an official helper. And if you'd like to support the channel and get early access to the Overwhelm Data Pack, please consider joining my Patreon. I plan to release this data pack to the public once some more biomes are covered by the Overwhelm, but for now, the early access, support, and bug testing of my patrons is incredibly valuable. Oh man, this is looking gorgeous.
I should say that the funny thing about this song that he's using here, the actual like YouTube video that shows the song, like the official release, it's pretty much ignored. Like nobody even sees it at all or anything. It's dead. But like this song, I mean, if we just look at the creator himself, excuse me. Yeah, he's had only 3 million views? Well, 3.8 million. That's nothing to scoff at, but still, like, but he's used that for a couple million, and yet the creator has not. The creator probably had no idea about it.
Already. It's so simple, but so effective, I think. We've got all of this tall seagrass creating this beautiful field that stretches over these hills. It adds so much texture and depth to the sea floor that you can tell both from swimming around in it, but also from above. It practically paints the water green, even though I haven't changed the watercolor at all for the biome. We've got plenty of these kelp plants. Most of them are 2 blocks tall. I think there can be a few that are only 1 block tall, yeah, but they all have that age 25, so they aren't going to grow. They aren't going to disrupt the beauty, the natural aesthetic of this biome, but they still allow you to get kelp from here if this happens to be near where you are. Now, I know I mentioned with the whale falls that I probably plan to use the glow lichen to draw particular attention to unique features and locations. I think for the lukewarm ocean in particular, it's really going to help draw the eye down to have kind of small patches of glow lichen spread throughout. It's not going to be super duper bright. It's not going to like shine a spotlight on the seafloor like it's going to do hopefully for like the whale falls and stuff, but it is going to kind of make the seafloor glow in a really nice way, especially for this being so shallow. I'm not too concerned about that. You'll notice here, this is one of those shelf structures, which I have made able to generate in this biome as well. They're much less common than in the oceans, and they don't have any of those coral features. So they're always going to only have some seagrass on them. But you can see that the disc feature that's changing the seafloor is also changing these from the stone and gravel to match the sand, sandstone, and moss noise pattern that the rest of the biome has. And that's able to be done simply by making the shelf structure get placed before all those discs that change the terrain. Let's fly over here where there is a shipwreck that we can take a look at, and we can see how that noise pattern is coming together. This is another example of using the sequence feature in order to place many features in the same relative position from one another. So first, it's placing a bunch of simple block features in the area to replace some of the wooden blocks of the shipwreck with these solid coral blocks. And then, the way that I'm handling the coral is mostly the same way I'm handling it in the whale fall, which is not simple blocks, but rather a disc feature or a few disc features that are getting placed in the area that are applying a bunch of rule-based state providers to determine if the block position that it's attempting to replace is valid, what type of block it's attached to, and what direction that block is, so that it can make the coral fans or regular corals or what have you get attached to only the blocks that they're allowed to be attached to. So fire coral blocks for fire coral blocks, horn coral blocks for horn coral, and so on, but also that they get rotated correctly. In 26.3, they're going to give us a new cuboid placement modifier that I'm excited to take advantage of and to talk about. But for now, discs are the best way that we have to do this, and it works really, really well. For the whale falls, I didn't make the coral match the blocks that it's being attached to, but I think it adds an extra level of intentionality to the shipwrecks in particular. Now, moving on to the deep lukewarm ocean, it should be pretty immediately obvious what has changed here. We now have this huge, beautiful forest of huge kelps that are growing from the seafloor made of leaves. This is actually what I was planning on doing for the kelp forests in the lunar phase ocean biomes, but I was having a lot of difficulty with the leaves in 26.1. For some reason, the waterlogged leaf blocks that I was placing by these tree features, even though they were persistent, were breaking as soon as World Gen happened. This wasn't happening with fossil features, which was strange, but it was happening with the tree features, so I had to stick with the horn coral blocks, which still turned out pretty good. In 26.2, though, whatever problem was causing that seems to have been removed, so I was able to use waterlogged leaf blocks for both the foliage of these tree features as well as waterlogged azalea leaf blocks for the trunks to make it look like these are just huge, leafy, kelpy structures, just like these kelp block columns, but that have grown and matured into these beautiful forests. In addition to the kelp block columns, I've also added some tall, big drip leaf block columns just to add a little bit more variety to this biome and serve as a kind of bridge between the kelp, the large kelp, and the azalea leaves right here. Plus the moss, frankly, actually. I think so far this is my favorite biome. I love the unique experience that you get swimming over and around these kelp trees. It is just absolutely gorgeous here. Whether you're in the kelp forest, the deep lukewarm ocean, or you're seeing it from afar, from like the lukewarm ocean over here, or even from the surface, you get that immediate, unique sense of wonder, which is exactly what I'm hoping all of my ocean biomes can have. I've gone ahead and added the behavior of the shipwreck colonies to the regular oceans as well, and that, like the whale falls, is going to carry over across all the oceans that we work on. Something else that I'm going to have carry over between all the ocean biomes, or at least most of them, is these sponge colonies right here. These are much more understated than the shipwreck colonies or the whale falls, but still serve, I think, a very fun and important purpose. Obviously, sponges are a pretty valuable resource and are typically confined only to the ocean monuments, but sponges do exist in nature, and so I wanted to pay homage to that and incorporate them into my custom ocean biomes. So I've made these small clusters of wet sponges able to generate pretty rarely, about the same rarity, even I think a little rarer than the whale falls, and they will always have some amount of seagrass as well as kelp growing on them. But it does still serve as a small indicator that this is a source of some kind of life and existence clinging to the seafloor, clinging to these natural sponges, without, I hope, disrupting the balance of the overworld too much. Now, we're only about a third of the way through the ocean biomes, so we need to get a move on. But before I move on to our next ocean biome, I want to pay special attention to the caves below all of the oceans. If you spent any time mining under an ocean, then you are probably familiar with the aquifer system. Aquifers are what fill caves with water, and they also create the pools of water and lava that you can find in caves throughout the world. Most of the time, as far as gameplay, they're very annoying. But here in the ocean biomes, they can serve a unique purpose for this Overwhelm project by giving us a lot of room to decorate the underground oceans in a way that is unique to oceans. Just like with my forest update and desert update videos, I want to make the caves across all of my biomes feel unique and distinct as you're mining through them, rather than just the same stony appearance across the entire overworld, even if that means dipping into the fantastical. So here in the ocean caves, for example, I want pretty much the entire walls, floors, and ceilings to be made of sandstone, a nice thick layer of sandstone up here at the stone layer. And then we can decorate the inside of these caves, these water-filled caves, with blocks that are related to the biome that they happen to be in. So in the regular lukewarm ocean, for example, we'll have plenty of seagrass populating the ground of these caves. But in the deep lukewarm ocean, we might have some more clusters of kelp. Now, not all the caves in ocean biomes are flooded with water. Some of them don't have any water, so we'll want to make sure that we're able to decorate these as well. It's still going to be entirely sandstone for the walls, floors, and ceilings, except for ores, of course. This is going to happen after ores get placed, and they're going to be ignored by the disk feature that we use for this. But we'll probably use some waterlogged vegetation patches afterwards to decorate the floor of these air-filled caves so that they can have some small pools of water where we can place yet more seagrass and kelp and such. As we get down to deep slate level,
Okay, I'm just gonna have to bring this up. I don't know why my playback is so shitty. I might actually take this into DaVinci or something, and then just be like, oh, another blunder, another blunder, another blunder, another blunder. Firefox, we have beef, or something like that. I don't know, but and I'm probably gonna cut that part out. But I mean, I'm so shit at editing, so whatever. But again, apologies.
generally want to maintain that kind of darker appearance and aesthetic and vibes that is created by the deep slate, and so I think I'll probably use mud for most of the ground as well as the walls, but then we'll use prismarine for the roof. Once again, kind of taking some things that are otherwise exclusive to the ocean monuments and bringing them out. In the case of prismarine, I don't think there's any real balance reason that this wouldn't be okay. It just makes this more accessible and in higher quantities for things like building and decoration. You can make an argument for sponges, but I see no reason that prismarine can't be naturally occurring in a fantasy environment. In addition to these pools of water that I'll once again carry over from the higher sandstone layer, I also think I'll incorporate some new and extra springs of water that are able to generate in the ceilings so that they create these weird waterfalls down to the floor of these caves that are also filled with these pools of water, so that we get this kind of standard and consistent visual motif that there's a lot of water in these caves, even if they're not necessarily flooded with them. Maybe they're flooding with water. I think that'll help tie together the aquifer caves with the non-aquifer caves and make them feel a little bit more cohesive, though the block palette is going to do a lot of that heavy lifting too. I also like to make a custom dungeon for each group of biomes, so let's head back to a flat world so we can take a look at those alongside the previous dungeons I've made. As with all 4 of the previous dungeons, the ocean dungeons here are going to be placed by a fossil feature, similar to the whale falls from before. These structures right here, these 3, are the fossil structure that's going to get placed first. They represent a series of mazes, in this case taking much more advantage of the verticality that's afforded by being completely flooded with water. And then this box of air right here is actually filled with structure voids and is going to be the overlay structure that gets placed on top. It's going to populate it with these chests, some of which are going to get replaced with air by a processor, as well as the black wool blocks that the processor is going to replace some of with air, and then the rest with assorted mob spawners. The mobs that I've chosen to populate and defend these dungeons are guardians, drowned, and zombie nautiluses that have drowned riding on them. However, because I incorporated sea lanterns into the design of these builds, I am going to have to make it so the processor that places those mob spawners also gives those mob spawners data so that those mobs are able to spawn in higher light levels, in light level 15, unlike regular mob spawners that cap out at light level 7. This is going to theoretically make these dungeons pretty good guardian and drowned farms, but I think that is a perfectly acceptable trade-off for the increased challenge and excitement that comes from these custom dungeons. We're not necessarily trying to completely rebalance them, there's nothing specifically wrong with the vanilla dungeons, but this is elevating it to a different, new experience. And although there is more dungeon loot, it isn't different dungeon loot, it's still the vanilla dungeon loot. And so the real reward of all these custom dungeons becomes the extra capacity afforded by having so many mob spawners tied together, and especially mob spawners for mobs that might be difficult to farm otherwise. Let's get all of the cave features added, and then we can see how these custom dungeons generate in those caves. Starting down here in the flooded aquifer caves.
Again, guys, I am so sorry about this horrible playback, but come on.
Below the deep lukewarm ocean, the changes here aren't necessarily super wide in breadth and scope, but I do think they still constitute a substantive change. The visual experience of swimming down into these caves, and especially finding these nice noise caves where there's a lot of these kelp block columns, the big drip leaves, and of course just the changes from the sandstone and stuff, it's technically transformative, though I recognize that it isn't necessarily a completely alien experience like some of the surfaces of these biomes have been, but I think that's okay because you don't want the caves to be particularly noisy or chaotic. We just want them to have a clear identity. Obviously, like I mentioned, up here in the upper sections of the world, we have the walls, floors, and ceilings all made entirely of sandstone. This is being handled in pretty much the same way as we did for the desert caves before, where we're using discs through all of these, especially because, of course, we want it to affect these flooded aquifer caves. So once again, vegetation patches aren't on the table. As we get lower down to deep slate level, we're using some slightly different discs that have a more substantial rule-based state provider, so that anywhere where we've got an exposed upper surface or mud above it, then we get a mud surface. And then as we get to the walls and ceilings, that's when we get that prismarine. And it creates a little bit of a noise effect here sometimes as the rules get a little bit confused, but it helps the ceiling and floor kind of mesh together a little bit, I think, and helps them feel a little bit more cohesive with each other, despite being pretty high contrast. It looks like we have a bit of a transition here from the fairly heavy kelp area below the deep lukewarm ocean, though certainly not as heavy as the surface, into the heavy seagrass area below the regular lukewarm ocean, which once again is a little bit more sparse than the surface biome, but still kind of feels like it belongs with it. We have fairly common small patches of seagrass. Now, an important distinguishing factor of this seagrass compared to the seagrass on the surface is that these are being placed by a simple block feature, and the reason for that is because the seagrass feature does not work in caves. It works just fine in the oceans where even under the water there's direct skylight, but here in caves it just completely fails to place. So we have to use simple blocks. Now, of course, I would prefer to use simple blocks. In fact, I'd prefer to use them on the surface, but as I mentioned before, tall seagrass cannot get placed by a simple block feature in 26.2, and so down here in the caves, we only get the single seagrass, the regular short seagrass. I haven't changed the frequency of magma down here, though it's possible that I will for at least some of the biomes, because especially now that there is kind of more to see down here, even if it isn't like super in-your-face exciting, I do kind of want to incentivize players being able to kind of swim around down here. Though obviously the correct meta when you're mining for all these exposed ores that are of course far easier to see with the sandstone walls and ceilings and floors is to bring some doors. We can come over to a regular ocean biome and take a look at how the non-flooded caves behave, and you'll see that we still have a fair amount of water down here on the ground that's being placed by a waterlogged vegetation patch, which is very convenient because A, it means that we get some nice puddles of water that don't overflow onto hills and walls and things. And B, this waterlogged vegetation patch, these little puddles and noisy bits of water, will not get applied to the flooded aquifer caves because vegetation patches don't work there. And so even among the oceans, there's a little bit of a distinct identity from the flooded caves and the non-flooded caves. The vegetation patches are placing some additional seagrass or other biome-appropriate plants, and the biome-appropriate plants can get placed in there by the other features that can affect the aquifer caves, so that should help kind of make the vegetation in these puddles a little bit more dense, despite being so shallow. Like I mentioned, I also added an additional spring feature that has a much higher count than the regular water spring feature, so you should in general see far more waterfalls coming out of the walls and especially the ceilings of caves. We have an example of that right here. This is not something that is normally done for the vanilla spring feature that's used in the overworld. This behavior is primarily used for the lava spring features in the nether, but it is a feature of the spring feature nonetheless, and one that I really like to use, especially for situations like this we want to imply kind of an active flooding. Now, while I'm happy with these caves and how they are transformative of the regular mining experience without sacrificing important elements, like obviously being able to see the ores and things, I do probably think I will come back and add a few more things as we develop some of the other biomes. Whether those new features are specific to the biomes that they get added to, or they are universal like the whale falls and stuff, we'll kind of have to see. We have a bit of a funny example here of a sort of open concept dungeon, I guess. This is not necessarily intended behavior, but also not behavior I can really do a lot to stop. Since I'm using the fossil feature to place these instead of the vanilla monster room feature, which of course is hard-coded to place specifically those cobblestone and mossy cobblestone dungeons, it means that I can't take advantage of the monster room's hard-coded behavior of only attaching themselves to kind of the edges of caves. And so while most of the time these dungeons will be completely embedded in stone, not connected to caves at all, we can get situations like this where they are very open and get kind of cut open by the caves. Now, thankfully, I've designed the processors to be a little bit cognizant of that. So you'll see, for example, we have right here an remaining section of the wall where previously there was solid rock. All the rest of this is open because the walls intersected with air that was already here from the caves, but the floors are unaffected. The floors do not get affected by that processor, and so regardless of what happens to the walls, regardless of where the fossil generates, there will be enough floors for the various mob spawners and chests to kind of sit on. Seems like these tight quarters are not very conducive to the zombie Nautilus riders. Maybe I'll give those drowned an enchantment that makes them immune to suffocation. Now let's move on to the cold ocean and the deep cold ocean. These are different, of course, from the frozen oceans, which we'll probably do next, but I wanted to get the cold oceans out of the way because I want to kind of have a nice progression of mentality, of thinking, as we move from lukewarm to cold and then to frozen, so that they can kind of feed into each other at least a little bit. I think for the regular cold ocean, I would like to repeat my kelp trees, though because this is a shallow ocean compared to the deep ocean that the deep lukewarm ocean was, they're going to be quite a bit shorter. I also think I'll play with the foliage color of the biome a little bit so that I can make the leaves more of a yellow, which I think suits the colder environment a little bit better. This will affect leaves like the mangrove leaves that we were using for the previous kelp trees and should carry over here just fine, but not the azalea leaves, which will keep this already kind of nice mossy green color that'll serve as a bit of a tie-in between the two. Now, I do think that probably isn't going to be enough to distinguish the cold ocean from the deep lukewarm ocean, so we'll probably add some additional features like maybe some boulders made of calcite that can serve as small colonies for, I'm thinking specifically horn coral and horn coral fans, so that we have a little bit of a color tie-in with the yellow leaves of the kelp trees. I'm not super sure what I want to do for the ground here. I don't feel like gravel works very well, but sand is also quite bright. So I might need to play with it a little bit and see if the sand actually ends up working once we have a more consistent coverage of trees, and especially these rocks and things, or if we need to do some kind of a noise pattern of maybe like sand and gravel, or maybe...
What if you tried using like concrete powder? Like, if you had concrete powder placed in the world gen, I mean, I've seen times where you have water and lava placing right next to each other, but but they don't update until you like update the blocks. So you could basically have it be like that, and then the moment you modify it even slightly, like all of a sudden, oh, we update, and then all the blocks update to being the whatever concrete item they're supposed to be.
Adding in some like andesite or something like that, just to kind of break it up a little bit and make it not necessarily super bright, while still being a nice, fine, cool tone for the cold ocean. Now, down in the deep cold ocean is where I do want to dip a little bit more into some fantastical elements. I think it'd be really interesting to have kelp trees here as well to serve as a bit of tie-in with the regular cold ocean, so we have a progression from kelp forest to perhaps thicker kelp forest. But I think the kelp trees here, it'd be really interesting if they were much older, much thicker, and had trunks, stems, roots, whatever, of stripped pale oak to be this kind of off-putting white color. We may use pale oak leaves to serve as the foliage for these particular kelp trees, but I may instead do like mangrove leaves like the other kelps and just use that biome color again to get them a little bit grayer, but also kind of bluish, probably a little bit bluer than even the pale oak trees, though there might be another way to kind of accomplish that too. Just to peek into my head a little bit as I'm ideating on this, I want to go for something like a twilight forest, not like the Twilight Forest mod, but like a sparkling, eerie, not necessarily gray and decaying like the pale oak suggests. In fact, I think I definitely don't want to use pale oak leaves. I want to kind of borrow their color some, but I want to use a different leaf so that it's a little bit of a different texture to it. But I think having skulk veins on the leaves, similar to how we do glow lichen on the kelp in the deep lukewarm ocean, will give it a kind of sparkly and bluish appearance, which should work well against a slightly grayer foliage color. And again, help this feel kind of like dark and spooky and eerie. Kind of drawing some inspiration from the deep twisty bridges from Subnautica Below Zero, as well as a little bit of elements from the like blood kelp zone from the original Subnautica game. And in fact, we can probably make that connection even more clear by having just occasional fire coral blocks in the foliage. Can still have some skulk veins on it as well, but I think that'll add a interesting pop of color, kind of like these blood pustules of sorts, while not disrupting the natural kind of spooky vibe that the biome will have. And to build on that even more, I think, and especially to distinguish it from some of the other kelp forests, I think it'd be really interesting if there was almost like a not like an algae, not like a kelp, but some kind of just a growth of these same kind of leaves all over the ground. I think this will give me something really interesting and new to play with because I've not really done something like this before. I probably am going to use, once again, a disc feature, but I think it'd be interesting, and I don't know if it's going to really work out and look nice, if we do a sort of noise pattern of leaves that also has water as the other states, so that it kind of just leaves us with a area of leaves that is above the surface instead of using it to just replace the surface directly. And then speaking of the surface, to help the biome feel a little bit darker to work.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to quickly stand up and go grab something to eat. I'm sorry, my body's like sleepy time. Apologies. I'm back. I'm a little chilly now, though. Just because it we haven't been having the heat wave died off for a short bit, so I also just grabbed a bit of food to munch down on because I'm hungry.
well, and frankly to contrast with the grayer and lighter colors that are coming in from this kelp, I think will make the surface mostly smooth basalt. It's a little bit of a darker color that doesn't necessarily feel out of place texture-wise or material-wise for an ocean seafloor, especially a deep one, but we'll still have a little bit of a noise pattern of some gravel kind of streaking in, not too dissimilar to how we did the oceans, so that there's these kind of brighter colors popping in as well to add a little bit of, visual, not noise, but excitement as the player looks down at the seafloor and through the thick kelp forest. I think this is all coming together to create some interesting ideas. I think it's going to be really, really cool and create, again, that nice progression from the lukewarm areas that are kind of brighter and greener into these cooler tones and eventually darker tones as we get into the deep, cold ocean. I actually really like the yellow color coming through the blue water here, and especially the brightness that it adds to this cool tone and the contrast that it has with the kelp here, especially in this cooler blue water. Like I mentioned, because we're in a shallower ocean, the kelp trees here are a fair bit shorter than the ones in the deep lukewarm ocean, and I actually opted to use different leaves than just mangrove for these. Most of their leaves are acacia, and then there's occasional individual jungle leaf blocks as well. And this is because the mangrove leaf texture has actually quite a few darker pixels on it, and so it was darkening this yellow color a little bit more than I was liking. And so these leaf textures ended up working a little bit better for that. Something I forgot to mention for those earlier kelp trees that I'm also using here is a block predicate filter in the placed features. Trees, of course, are able to generate largely wherever now. This wasn't always the case, but since about 1.17, we've been able to have a wide range of control over where and how trees are able to generate, which of course is how we're able to get them underwater, regardless of the blocks that they're made of. And of course, while most of the time this would be great, I don't want these kelp trees to be able to extend above the water, because that just wouldn't make sense for the vibe that I'm going for. So in the placed feature that is placing the kelp as well as these kelp trees, I have a block predicate filter that's just checking if the block about 10 blocks above the position that it's attempting to place at, the ground, is water. If it's not, then it completely fails to place. The exact height that I'm checking varies from feature to feature, so for these smaller kelp trees, it's about 10 blocks that it needs of space, whereas for those taller kelp trees, I think I had it up as high as 13 or 14. The regular kelp doesn't need nearly as much space. If we fly over here, I think, yeah, we saw these kelp features need maybe about 6 blocks-ish of space. And so as we get into this higher, not quite a sandbar, but this higher area of gravel, we get much less of the kelp because it is less able to find valid spawning for the conditions that I've set for it. The kelp is being placed by block column still, so in the block column feature, I'm able to say, hey, you can't grow unless there is water there. But for the trees, we don't necessarily have that same kind of behavior. So even if there are 10 blocks of water above the position it tries to grow at, there is a chance it could be tall enough to extend out of the water. And so we have an additional kind of fail-safe. Instead of using a simple state provider for the leaves and indeed for the trunk as well, I'm using a rule-based state provider that is basically just saying, hey, if there is not water above you, or if you're not going to replace water and there's not water above that, then you place water instead of placing leaves, or rather you place nothing. Before moving on to the deep cold ocean, we can talk a little bit about the surface here, which I decided to handle primarily with the tree features actually, rather than using discs. I decided to keep the basic gravel surface for the sea floor, but the tree features have an alter ground decorator in them that is placing a kind of funky noise pattern of sand and gravel. So it kind of creates the illusion or implication that they need to grow on sand, or sand kind of appears around them as a result of their natural behavior, without just having the entire biome be sand and kind of sacrificing the nice cool tones that the gravel applies to the water. And I think this ends up working well. You don't get too much sand, but it helps break things up a little bit. And then lastly, for this biome, let's see if we can find one of those horn coral boulders. Here we go. They're reasonably common. and are just a sequence that first places a few block blobs of calcite in a small area, and then places a disk that has the block state provider, the weighted block state provider, and rule-based provider to check for the appropriate faces for all the horn corals and horn coral fans. Same kind of tech and behavior that we've been using for the whale falls, and more specifically the shipwrecks, since the horn coral can only be placed on the calcite. Now let's fly on over to the deep cold ocean and see, oh, this is a small one. Here we go. We can fly on over into the deep cold ocean and see how that has come together. And already we get this stark contrast. We still have the sort of transition effect thanks to the thick kelp here, but it is much darker, much cooler, and much more eerie here. Oh, it looks like we had a bit of a collapse down there. We've gotten a pretty close color to the pale oak leaves for the mangrove leaves, but I think in particular, using the mangrove leaves here, where those dark pixels, those dark colors can really work well with the color choice that we've gone for this biome, adds a whole new effect to this area compared to the kelp forest that we see in the deep lukewarm ocean. Of course, the skulk veins are helping quite a lot with that as well. We get this kind of strange overgrowth kind of sensation from it, and of course their animated texture adds these kind of sparkly stars as you're swimming through the kelp. I think the contrast from these gray kelp leaves to the stark white trunks that are kind of almost alien, especially with these fire coral pustules coming out of them, and then the darker surface where we still have some gravel, but I actually went ahead and added some more mud as well. Serves as a little bit of a darker block than the smooth basalt, helps break the texture up of the smooth basalt that is a little bit more kind of noisy and chaotic, whereas the mud serves as a nice neutral kind of texture, but allows the smooth basalt to still kind of pop and stand out and darken the whole area. I also think the leaf coverage down here on the ground turned out pretty nice. I think it adds just a little bit of extra something, a little je ne sais quoi to the ground cover here, especially as the skulk veins start to grow on it. I also went ahead and added a few small pockets of sea pickles as well. We got pretty lucky here with 3 kind of all in one area, but as you're swimming around, you'll see them, fairly often, but not completely covering the area. They're not necessarily intended to provide like a lot of light to draw the eye down necessarily, though they certainly will do that, and are more so just to kind of tie the ground together with the sparkles from the skulk veins, which is why there are no 4 sea pickles down on the ground here. Only 1, 2s, and 3s can generate. Because 4 would simply be too bright. See, already, even just with my shaders and with night vision on everything, that is just a world of difference from the gentle glow of the 3 that I think would betray the dark, kind of eerie, spooky nature of the rest of the deep, cold ocean. This is also the first time I think that it's worth coming above the surface and seeing how we're affecting the islands in this biome. As with all the other ocean biomes, normally the islands that can generate here sort of by accident are generally pretty low, maybe a few blocks above the surface of the water, but only like 2 or 3 or so. Here we have these nice white cliffs that are kind of trying to go for a bit of a Mediterranean type of feel. I'm using vegetation patches so that we can place them only on the dry land instead of under the water, that then place some block column features to extend upward a specific number of blocks. The block columns are always the same height, so the topography that you see of the island here is identical to the topography that it would have had before I added my own features to it. It's basically just elevated so that we get these really cool cliffs. And then on top of it, we're placing a few features of grass, some bushes, and sweet berry bushes to kind of imply a bit of like a olive or grape or wine association. And then we have some trees here that are sort of meant to mimic an Italian cypress. I'm not entirely sure how common Italian cypress trees or Mediterranean cypress trees are in nature. I have seen some pictures of some forests, but I don't know if they're more like orchards and they've been man-grown. They're certainly used a lot in decoration, but I think that they create a very specific feel and sensation that suits these islands very well. So most of the trees are these skinny spruce foliage placers, with a few of them extending just a little bit bigger for the maybe older cypresses. And because they are cypresses, because they are a conifer of sorts, they are using spruce leaves for their foliage, but for the actual trunk, I'm using acacia logs because the gray log, I think, suits the area a little better, suits the cool tones of these biomes a little better. We'll go back and do the islands of the other oceans later, but since I was here and since there happened to be an island here as I was messing with all the rest of these underwater features, it just seemed appropriate, and I had a pretty clear vision in mind for what I was looking for. Before we get to those other islands though, as promised, it's time to take a look at the frozen ocean and the deep frozen ocean. These are probably going to be pretty challenging biomes for me. Technically, they kind of want to be a little bit more sparse, especially under the surface. A lot of their identity is handled pretty well by all of the ice and the icebergs, especially in the regular frozen ocean. And I don't necessarily want to disrupt that, though I do probably want to make a few changes to it. Some of these icebergs, I can probably point a few out. I'm gonna guess that one. Oh, these two for sure. Probably this one. In fact, I think definitely this one, are all being placed by an iceberg feature. It's just a particular feature type that is reasonably hard-coded, but does at least allow us to set the block state, though I will be using the same block states that the vanilla features use, which is packed ice and very occasionally blue ice. There's not a whole lot necessarily to change with these, though I'm probably going to play a little bit with their frequencies, especially between the frozen ocean and the deep frozen ocean, where in vanilla they have the same frequencies for both variants. However, all of these larger, kind of spikier icebergs are not being placed by features, nor are they technically being placed by terrain. These are what are referred to as a sort of special terrain feature. There's a few of these in the game. The hoodoos in the Eroded Badlands are another example, and they're not, again, placed by features or by terrain, but they are placed by a noise that is in the vanilla data pack, but isn't necessarily referenced by anything data-wise. It is hard-coded to be used and to apply and to generate in these specific biome IDs, the frozen ocean and the deep frozen ocean for these icebergs. I've never really messed with these before, I just know that they can be messed with, so I would like to experiment a little bit with those noises. I don't know exactly how flexible they are and how much control I have, so I'm kind of keeping my options open, but I think it would be nice if we could get the icebergs to be a fair bit larger, and maybe not necessarily quite as pointy. Additionally, the deep frozen ocean does not have the frozen temperature modifier that the regular frozen ocean has. You'll notice, of course, that in the frozen ocean, the ice that is covering the water and the snow that covers the islands here is in this kind of weird, noisy pattern. As far as I know, this is not controlled by a noise, at least not a noise in the data pack. But it is being applied in this way thanks to a simple modifier that can be applied in the biome that just changes how temperature works for freezing things, for snowfall and such. The deep frozen ocean does not use this temperature modifier, and it is warm enough that ice is not able to form on the surface of the water. And while this does make sense, especially for the vanilla overworld, I think it's kind of a shame. So I think I am going to very specifically make the deep frozen ocean also have that pattern of frozen ice. It may not be as realistic, but I think it's going to create a bit of a more cohesive experience, and then we can differentiate these two biomes with the underwater features. The regular frozen ocean is probably going to be pretty similar to the regular ocean as well. There's going to be some small patches of seagrass, some small patches of probably some like medium-sized kelps that won't grow, but they're going to be fairly sparse. We don't want it to be like the lukewarm ocean or the cold ocean. We want it to kind of feel like the ice does have an effect on the biodiversity down here, or at least how well the life that does exist here is able to kind of grow and spread. Now, with that said, we do need some interesting kind of visuals down here, so I think similar to the cold ocean, we'll probably have some boulders of smooth basalt, like we had for the boulders of calcite, that can have some tube corals on them, because I think the blues will work very well for this particular biome. The deep frozen ocean is where I want to lean a little more into, once again, some fantasy elements. And so to get that idea across, I think it's time to return to the flat world and build some concepts for some templates that I can place down here. I hope you like jellyfish. This is definitely like super duper out there, but I think especially with what I'm imagining the ice will look like over the deep frozen ocean, having some built jellyfish kind of just hovering in the middle of the water will create a really, really cool and interesting effect. We have 4 different variants, and they're largely the same throughout. They're all made of this bubble coral block, which is not dying because the tick rate is frozen right now. And then they have these waterlogged hanging roots to kind of stimulate the tentacles or stingers that would be under the jellyfish. We've got a small variant, a tall variant, bit of a medium variant, and a large variant, and they all have just slightly different positions and frequencies of the hanging roots down here. I'm going to place these with template features so that they can stay intact and not need to be projected to a height map in order to remain intact like a fossil would, but unfortunately that means that I cannot apply a processor to them, which I would very much like to. So instead, I'll have to do pretty much the same trick I've been doing for many of the other templates that we have, and placing a disk over them after the fact by way of a sequence feature. That disk is going to replace a random assortment of the bubble coral blocks with pearlescent frog lights, which again is a bit of a balance break perhaps, but for what is ultimately a decorative block and for a fairly rare biome, I feel like it's not going to be the end of the world, and will create a really
I'm just gonna check the chat, see if anyone's here. Nope, nobody's here in chat. Why am I not surprised? Okay, no one's in chat.
exciting effect, especially, I hope, as you're walking above the ice and walking over the deep frozen ocean. You see all these lights from the jellyfish dancing below you. That's going to be so awesome, I hope. I'm sure we'll be able to come up with some features to go along with these jellies that would fit in a environment that these jellyfish would live in, probably reusing a few features like the cold kelp and so on, but we'll also have some of that sparse seagrass and kelp like in the regular frozen ocean to tie them together a bit. Let's see if the final result assuages any concerns you might be having with the choice of blocks and structures. Alright, starting above the ice in the deep frozen ocean to get that glimmer, that experience as players are going to see it, we can see those pearlescent frog lights shining through the ice just barely, but it's only once we get over to the water and dive on in that we're able to really see. This is so pretty. This is beautiful. I love how the jellies light up the middle of the ocean, this area of water that, isn't really normally filled, and certainly isn't filled since we're using these shorter kelp features from the cold ocean instead of some taller ones that we might find in like the deep cold ocean. And it creates some interesting storytelling as well. Even though this is a deep ocean where there will be room for taller kelp, because it's so cold, this kelp maybe isn't able to grow as fast or as tall. And maybe also the jellies are eating it as it grows. Certainly, although there is much more kelp here than in some of the other biomes, it is much shorter here, though it doesn't have that age 25, so it is going to be able to grow. And I hope that is only going to add to the effect of the pearlescent frog lights shining through the even thicker kelp forest that grows underneath this deep frozen ocean. We have a few of these shelves being reused here too that are able to have some sea pickles generating on and near them, including some 4 sea pickles, some groups of 4, unlike in the Twilight Forest, because we want that brighter glow like we have for the pearlescent frog lights. And of course we still have a few bits of seagrass kind of peppered sparsely throughout, and a very nice shipwreck over here if I say so myself. Oh, look at this little mushroom island just kind of hugging in between all of these icebergs. They'll be in a later video, don't worry. Speaking of the icebergs, I think I got them to a pretty satisfactory state. Like I was hoping, they do tend to be a fair bit larger, but sort of the compromise to this is that there tend to be also larger areas where there are not those large noise-based icebergs. They're also generally much rounder. We don't have quite as many of those points, or those points are generally much wider and much larger, almost like huge mountain peaks. The difference, I would say, is probably subtle. I suspect most players that didn't watch this video aren't even really going to know that there's anything different about them, but it's a meaningful change to me. It makes me feel a little bit happier about the changes that we're making to this biome. Now, because we have all this ice, it's a little bit harder to make our way and find our way to the regular frozen ocean, but it looks like this is going to be that. Okay, great. For the regular frozen ocean, I opted to change the sea floor to sand and sandstone instead of keeping it the same gravel that the deep frozen ocean has, and instead of doing a similar thing like we did with the cold ocean. I think here in particular it works very nicely. Because of the ice, it gives me a similar vibe to the Subnautica below zero biome that is underneath the icebergs, where we have just kind of this general plains of this fine material, sand or similar material. It wouldn't necessarily be this pale, but I don't think the current color of the sand betrays the aesthetic too much. Especially when we have these boulders of smooth basalt as well that are reasonably common and can get pretty large to help supply that little bit of darkening and blue.
I'm sorry guys, I'm just really tired. How much do we have left? About 20 minutes. The reason I keep like nodding off is because I'm literally like falling asleep in my chair. Like I'm supposed to finish this, but just stretch, walk around, get my blood technique in. What time is it? It's damn. It's almost 10:30, which means I'll basically have to shut up completely after this. Lovely.
Winning as well with the tube coral. Now, when it comes to the islands in the frozen oceans, I was a little bit lost at first, but I think I'm pretty satisfied with where we ended up. I decided that I wanted a bit more of a rocky feel to them, kind of like there's, really it's too cold for things to cling to life very well on these islands. And so we have a surface made pretty much entirely of tuff, and then we have a few occasional spikes of some tough pillars, similar to what we've done in the wastes and in some places of the witch realm and such, using the feature that I learned from Incendium. However, that doesn't mean there is no life here. What is able to cling to life on these rocky islands are these nice pale oak trees that are pretty different from the pale oak trees that you would find in the Pale Garden. I'm trying to kind of make them feel particularly separate from the Pale Garden. So for example, they cannot have creaking hearts, they don't have any pale moss hanging or otherwise around them, and instead, under them you can occasionally get some packed ice blocks, almost like icicles are kind of sprouting from their leaves. The leaves are gray because they're frozen, not because they're decayed. But now I think it's time for a vacation to some warmer climates. I've been putting off the warm ocean biome for long enough, and I think I have some ideas for how we can distinguish it and elevate it from the vanilla warm ocean without sacrificing the unique identity that it admittedly already has compared to the other vanilla ocean biomes. I think the main challenge is going to be trying to distinguish the deeper warm ocean area from the shallower warm ocean area, because the warm ocean, unlike any of the other temperature ocean biomes, does not have a deeper variant, but nevertheless is able to generate into the deeper terrain. We're going to have to make effective use of that block predicate filter I introduced earlier to check how much room there is above the sea floor in order to determine if we are in a deep area of the warm ocean biome or in a shallow area, and place a feature relative to that. Because this is all still one biome, I think we'll make it probably far more cohesive than some of the other shallow and deep biome pairings have been, but I still want to incorporate some elements that clearly distinguish it. Now, I think first off, similar to how we have these shelves in some of the other biomes, it'd be really cool if the warm oceans had their own kind of unique template terrain feature. And I think a kind of natural archway or bridge would be a great way to start to incorporate the coral into the rest of the biome. I don't know necessarily how realistic or common arches like this are in nature, but they show up a lot in aquariums, and I think they look great there. So whether or not they are particularly natural or not, I definitely want to incorporate them here as part of the warm ocean identity. And again, this will be a great way, I think, to incorporate in particular the coral blocks that have been mostly absent from all the other biomes. They still appear in shipwrecks and things, and we've got like the fire coral blocks in the deep cold ocean, but I think if we do some discs of various types of blocks of coral and we keep each individual disc consistent across the entire disc, so horn coral discs and bubble coral discs and brain coral discs and so on, that'll hopefully create a really cool natural coral reef aesthetic that we wouldn't just get from using the vanilla coral features. And speaking of those vanilla coral features, I think I don't plan to use them at all. In 26.2, they're completely hard-coded, so we are left to the whims and mercy of however it is that they behave, and would need to then use sequences and disks and things to change the blocks and such after the fact. And while technically in 26.3, some of them become unhard-coded according to the change logs, I've taken a look at them, and unhard-coded is a pretty strong word, I would say, for what's happened to them. So regardless of the version that we're in, I think I'm going to make my own, probably again using trees. I've already done something very similar for the wastes when I made a bunch of the dead coral shapes, and so we'll probably just reuse a lot of those. We've got like a bit of a dome shape that we'll be able to use, something more similar to the claw or tree coral feature that vanilla has. The only thing we won't be able to carry over from the waste features is the decorators that we're placing the coral fans on the trees. For some reason, the attached to logs and attached to leaves decorators that I was using to place the coral fans on those coral trees in the wastes does not support placing the decorated feature, the block that you define, in water. It'll fail to place unless the position that it's attempting to place that decorator on is air, and so we can't use that underwater here. So once again, if we want to get tube corals and horn coral fans and things on our various coral features, we'll need to place a bunch of discs to be able to populate them with. But that works for me because we already have the disc feature to be able to manage what blocks the various fans are able to be placed on, checks the rotation and everything like that, so it shouldn't be too difficult. There will be some seagrass and kelp here as well, probably in a similar kind of density to maybe what we saw in the frozen ocean is going to be my guess, but obviously we want the corals to kind of take center stage there, so while the feature might technically be able to place that many, it may not actually place that many because the corals are going to be so dominant. We'll also, of course, have some sea pickles, particularly on the arches and things, but I think the sea pickles might also be the major distinguishing factor for the deep warm ocean areas, where we'll use higher densities and likelihoods for the 4 groups of sea pickles to brighten things up. This will really be that opportunity to serve as a spotlight to draw the player down into the deep warm ocean that doesn't necessarily receive the same level of light. Oh, I guess I have been in the deep warm ocean, whoops. That doesn't necessarily receive the same level of skylight that the shallow warm oceans have. Handling the arches should be able to be done in the same way as we did with the shelves and whale falls and things before with templates, so shouldn't be any real reason to go back to the flat world and show you how that works. So I will see you in a little bit once we have a completed warm ocean to look at. As you can see, I added a few extra features to the warm ocean as well, just to kind of break things up. But before we get to that, look at these palm trees. These are so cool. I think these are like the thing I'm most proud of in this project so far. They're so simple. It's all just one feature, just a simple straight trunk placer. But for the foliage provider, I'm using a rule-based state provider that basically just checks for each position if there is a jungle log 2 blocks or 3 blocks away and up or down, so that we get this really awesome kind of fan shape that comes out of it. When the trees get close enough to each other, obviously we get a few kind of weird, kind of rogue fronds over here, but I think that actually kind of adds a little bit to the effect. It makes them kind of, fit together a little bit, and probably won't even really be that noticeable. They're palm trees. They're so cool. I even used an attached to logs decorator for the cocoa beans instead of using the cocoa decorator that the jungle trees normally use. And the reason for that is I can make them have a very high chance for each block position along that trunk to attempt to place, but use, once again, a rule-based state provider to have it check if there's jungle leaves above it, to force them to only successfully place at the very top of the trunks instead of kind of spread all throughout. All such simple techniques that work together to create a perfectly elegant result. I love these so much. I've added them as well to the islands of the oceans and lukewarm oceans, but they are the most dense here in the warm oceans. So out there you might only see one, if any, on a particular island, but on these warm ocean biome islands, of course, as you can see, you might get 4 or even more, depending on the size of the island. Let's dive down below the waves though and take a look at how we're decorating the warm ocean proper. Obviously, as you can see probably right away, we have these kelp features that are being carried over, very similar from the lukewarm ocean. They're using the green color, but are closer in shape to what we saw in the cold ocean and the frozen ocean. I just felt like the biome needed a little bit more to more clearly separate itself from the vanilla warm ocean biome. I do have some unique behaviors being applied to the coral here that you might already be able to guess, but my suspicion was that it would not be obvious enough to the layman player to be able to tell that anything had changed, and so I added the kelp here to really be that kind of signifier. Now, I am pretty proud of the coral, not only that the coral shapes were able to be applied well with all of these trees, not only that the disc features were able to apply the fans and the coral types only on the types of blocks that we wanted with those correct rotations, but in particular because, as you might be able to tell, I'm using a noise-based provider for all of those coral blocks so that we kind of get this very interesting noisy gradient between all the various types of coral. You get large swaths of horn corals that are all near each other, that all might be related to each other, even part of the same organism. And then you have smaller pockets of the tube corals that are all grouped together, the fire corals grouped together, and so on. We have an example over here of one of the arches, which I'm actually using a fossil feature for instead of a template, because I realized I actually do want them to kind of melt with the terrain a little bit, to kind of become a little bit uneven and potentially even break apart. I think that's totally fine compared to something like the shelves that I do want to remain intact. Speaking of the shelves, I do have those represented here as well. They are using the same discs that is on the arches over there to create these kind of smaller clustered coral reefs that are distinct from the more corally tree shapes that we have out there. And the arches and shelves are being separated from one another into larger regions using a noise-based count placement modifier, similar to what I've done in some previous projects such as the waste, to have a cactus region and a spike region depending on the noise, while still having them all in the same biome. So in some areas you'll have only arches, and in some areas you'll have only shelves. I opted for a density of seagrass and kelp that was more similar to the frozen ocean, the regular frozen ocean, or indeed the regular ocean, compared to the deep frozen ocean like I was originally planning, because I just didn't like how it affected and sort of took away almost from the corals over here. That's also why these coral trees, of course, they're present, but they aren't like dominating. They add a nice shape, especially to the horizon, and they serve as that kind of tent pole, that indicator that something is different here, but they don't take away from the coral that really should be center stage. Now, once again, as planned here in the shallow warm oceans, sea pickles are primarily relegated to the shelves and to the arches, but as you get over to the deeper areas of the warm ocean, that's where you start to see sea pickles dotting much of the ground away from those templates and fossils. And those will help to, again, serve as that spotlight and drive the player down to be able to see all of the corals and such here, which are also being handled by a noise-based count similar to what is used by the vanilla warm ocean vegetation, though I've made them a little bit more common than that. Actually, quite a bit more common. I feel a little bad that that really is basically all there is to say about this biome. It's not that it's uninteresting, but it's using a lot of the techniques that we've already been able to kind of dissect and discuss, and so we've been able to talk about all the really cool things, the corals, the noise-based count, all the various tree types, and even using the block predicate filter to determine if we're in a deeper area of the ocean so that these sea pickles get placed. So with that, we started in the regular ocean biome, and I think it's time that we end it in the deep ocean biome. I've been uncertain what to do for the deep ocean biome. It doesn't seem right to just make it an extension of the regular ocean biome. Once again, I want each of these biomes to have a more distinct identity, and while we've been flexible with that from time to time, especially for the frozen oceans, to create some cohesion, I think for this particular biome, I want to go something a little bit more drastic. I think I want the deep ocean to feel very volcanic, like this is where tectonic plates are converging under the water and creating probably some like vents of volcanic activity that are kind of propping up. And so I think this is a great opportunity to make use of the fact that we're in 26.2 and have access to Cinnabar. I think pretty much the bulk of the terrain down here is going to be Cinnabar, the surface, the seafloor, with probably some sulfur as well to kind of break it up, very similar to how it is used in the sulfur caves. I'm going to try very hard to not make this biome feel just like the sulfur caves but underwater, but to a certain extent I think it's probably going to be unavoidable, especially with how new and top of mind these blocks are. For example, because I want it to kind of look like there are volcanic vents here, it only makes sense to include some of these sulfur spikes. They have that perfect shape and coloration and indeed material that actually suits that aesthetic and that idea that the deep ocean is trying to capture. And so, you know, it's gonna look like the sulfur caves, but it's because kinda we're both drawing from the same inspiration to a certain extent. I also think I'll carry over the vent structures that I made for the lunar phase, but I will do exactly as I plan to do in that project and replace the netherrack that I used there with Cinnabar, and also replace the soul sand that I had in the vents themselves for the bubble columns with potent sulfur. So we get much subtler bubbles that aren't necessarily disrupting the surface as much as soul sand or magma blocks would, but that make more sense mechanically and aesthetically and thematically than soul sand or magma blocks would in this particular case. Now, with that said, I think we will still have a higher concentration of magma blocks, particularly here on the seafloor, where you don't typically see them too much. They are usually relegated to the caves, but I think I would very much like to have them fairly common on the seafloor here so that these do disrupt the surface and make the area feel fairly volcanic. And because they're emissive, it should also serve as a similar kind of spotlight effect to bring the player's eye down to be able to see what will hopefully be a very cool biome. I just need to copy those structure templates over from that lunar phase project and change the blocks, so I will go ahead and skip ahead to when we have a completed deep ocean biome. I messed around with it for a little bit, and I did kind of end up determining initially that the biome felt a little bit too close to the sulfur cave. So rather than having the bulk of the surface cover the seafloor, at least as far as my disk feature is concerned, be Cinnabar and sulfur blocks, I opted to do a noise pattern of Cinnabar with these nice long streaks of sand. And I think that tends to work a little bit better here. We do have some sulfur blocks being placed by the speleothem features here that are placing these sulfur spikes, these sulfur speleothems. And so while these are common, they don't necessarily make up as much of the surface as the Cinnabar and the sand does. I also still made sure to include quite a bit of the seagrass and kelp here. Once again, I want those in all the biomes, and this is no exception, but I didn't want it to be like super duper sparse here, like even in like the warm ocean, for example. So it adds this nice kind of painting of green over the Cinnabar and helps again further distinguish it from the sulfur caves, despite having those similar block palettes and frankly densities. The kelp is age 25, so it is these kind of shorter, medium-sized block columns that won't grow and therefore won't disrupt the natural aesthetic of this biome. And then the seagrass is pretty common and generally is short, with a small chance for some tall. The magma blocks are pretty noticeable, especially because they're emissive, of course, but they aren't completely dominating the terrain, and a lot of that is helped by the fact that I've made it so that they can only replace sand, not Cinnabar. And so they kind of create these really awesome streaks when they do end up in these high density of these bubble columns, rather than just having a random assortment across the entire biome. The vents, as promised, have the potent sulfur down inside of them, and those are able to update just fine because they're being placed by templates. And because I really liked the shape that these vents added to the sea floor here, very similar to how we have like the kelp trees in the warm ocean biome and other places that help break up the horizon as you're swimming along the sea floor, this is not the only place that I added them. Because I already felt like the caves were kind of missing something, I decided to add these vent templates to all of the ocean caves. They are generally more common lower underground thanks to a biased to bottom height range placement modifier, and then they use an environment scan to move downward if they generated in the air so they can find the ground to get placed on. I designed the template so that there is a block of water always above the potent sulfur, whereas all of the rest of the template uses structure voids so that it can adapt to whether it is in air or in water, so whether it's in an open cave, an aquifer cave, or under the surface, but is always going to have that water above it so that we get those geysers out of them as you explore these underground exposed caves. Over here we can look and see how they behave in the flooded aquifer caves. Obviously we don't get the geysers anymore, but I still think the bubbles that emit from these potent sulfur blocks help add a lot, and they especially continue to help break up the mud under the surface here. Oh, look at that. We actually have a regular sulfur cave over here. That's funny. This area has a bunch of them, which I think is really awesome. Ultimately, I think I'm pretty proud of how this biome turned out. I think it does a good job of distinguishing itself from the Sulfur Caves biome despite using so many of the same blocks, and also still has those cohesive elements that are shared among all the ocean biomes, like the sponge colonies, and of course, whale falls, the shipwreck coral colonies, and so on. I hope that you agree and believe as I do that the transformation of these ocean biomes have undergone for the overrealm is absolutely gorgeous and will hopefully create a great visual, distinct identity for all these ocean biomes and for the Overrealm project proper from the vanilla overworld, expanding upon this already awesome and beautiful landscape. Remember to like and subscribe for more custom world gen structures and data pack content. Check the link in the description to learn more about getting into custom world gen with my very thorough written guide. And to support the channel, get early access to the Overrealm and other data pack projects, and participate in NPC fights at the end of every video like this one, please consider joining my Patreon. Congratulations to today's winner, Uda Mask, and thanks for watching!
So that was Kanokorov's video. It's now like 10:46, 15 minutes after I should have stopped doing stuff, but oh, I'm sorry guys, I am just so tired. So, as interesting as it was, I was literally nodding off during the episode, like during the stream and everything, which is kind of embarrassing, but at least I didn't completely fall asleep during stream. That would have been even more embarrassing to find out about. But as always, stay safe, stay sane, and stay whole.